So let me introduce today's speakers, Bridie McGreavy and Gabby Hillyer. Bridie is an assistant professor in communication and journalism at the University of Maine. She's a faculty fellow in the Mitchell Center. All of her collaborations and all of her colleagues have benefited tremendously from her expertise in how communication shapes our efforts to help understand and solve complex problems. And you'll quickly get the sense of that. Bridie's been doing this work for quite a while. She began her work on shellfish nearly 10 years ago during the early stages of her PhD research at UMaine. But if you pull on some of the threads from which this work is woven, you may be surprised to find that they are also connected to her senior thesis research that she conducted way back when she was a student and undergraduate at Bates College. Bridie's a leader in her own right, but she's also committed to shared leadership. She embodies the Mitchell Center's commitment to kind of a long-term effort. These are complex challenges. They don't have quick fixes, so we're going to have to stick with it. And you'll see all of that in her presentation. Gabby is an outstanding PhD student at UMaine in the Ecology and Environmental Sciences program. She's also involved in the National Research Traineeship Program, the major NSF grant that's focused on conservation science. Gabby is a great example of how a new generation of leaders and problem solvers is emerging from the University of Maine. And I predict Gabby and many of your colleagues are going to make enormous contributions to assessing sustainability challenges, partly because they're sticking with it for the long haul. As you'll hear, Dr. Tony Sutton is also playing many important roles in this work, but he isn't able to participate in today's presentation. So I'll turn it over to Bridie and Gabby. The title of their presentation is Strengthening Learning, Leadership, and Equity in Maine and Wabanaki Wild Shell Fisheries.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. We're very excited to be sharing this work focused on the Maine Shellfish Learning Network. And I'm going to pull up my slides. So as David mentioned, unfortunately, Tony Sutton is not able to join us today, but he is central to this work. And Gabby and I are going to be channeling Tony in our talk in multiple ways. But one of the ways is by starting with story, as this is one of the many commitments that Tony brings to this work. And story for us is also about forming connections. In this case, connections about what this work means for me and Gabby, and also about how engagement with shellfish has connected with us and changed us in the process. So my opening story, kind of picking up on David's theme of threads here, this is going to be a running theme, traces to an experience that I had in my master's program at Antioch University, where I had the great fortune of spending a week on Pazumcook, which is also known as Mount Desert Island, with Tom Wessels, who is a well-known naturalist. We were studying fire ecology, but as a side field trip, Tom took us out to harvest mussels. So we waited until the low tide and went out into this long, narrow inlet, also known as Some Sound. And I distinctly remember wading in and going into the low tide area, finding those mussels that were that dark blue, about 2 inches long, the razor sharp edge, preferably barnacle free, gathering a few handfuls, and then bringing the mussels back to our campsite, cooking them almost immediately over a campfire. And it was one of the most delicious meals I had ever had. I'd never done anything like that before. And I remember thinking to myself, like, you can just do this? You can walk down to the shore and wade into the tide and harvest mussels and also clams and bring them back and have one of the most local, freshest dinners imaginable. And so in that moment, mussels and later clams really took hold. It cast a bissel thread into my own life and changed it in ways I never would have anticipated. So over the last 15 years, along with many other experiences like these, in forms of attachment, wild mussels and clams and the livelihoods and cultures that they support have become a core focus for our work, and that's what we're planning to share today. So we'll start by providing some context for the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, the history that this work builds on. We'll introduce some of the communication, adaptation, and resilience concepts that we've been thinking with and that have shaped our work. And then we'll share key commitments for our engaged research design, what that means in practice. And then Gabby will take over and we'll talk about some of our project activities and insights that are emerging from the development of a water quality decision tree, a website that we call the Mudflat, and a host of applied shellfish projects that we've been connecting with and supporting. And then I'll come back in at the end to offer some concluding thoughts related to how this work connects with developing adaptive forms of governance, as well as how we think about the force of the tides and what we call these tidal imaginaries for working across both Maine and Wabanaki contexts. So this opening story hopes to illustrate how wild clams and clam and mussel fisheries mean multiple things in Maine and Wabanaki nations. Wabanaki peoples have relied on and stewarded intertidal fisheries for time immemorial. As Alice Kelly, Bonnie Newsome, Joseph Nicoller have documented, these great mounds of clam, mussel, and oyster shells attest to this long-term reliance and stewardship as part of sustenance, fishing livelihoods, and at the intersection of food and tribal sovereignty. And the many Wabanaki place names tell this story of intertidal inhabitation as well. As Geo Neptune has described, the place, also called Bar Harbor, is known as Monaskati, S for clams, Monas for digging, and Katik for location, referring to the sandy intertidal that stretches out into the bay between Bar Harbor and Gouldsboro as clam gathering place. White settler communities have also relied on intertidal shell fisheries since colonization, adding to these shell mounds and creating new ones. And clam harvesters, especially those who have been doing this for their entire lives, tell these incredible rich stories about growing up clamming and clamming within their families, and how those memories and experiences shape their own identities and create a very strong and rich connection to place. And then finally, this quote that we're sharing here helps highlight some of the economic and social equity values, where one of the participants in our interviews noted, this fishery is very important because it's one of the places you don't have to come from a family with money to be able to enter it. And it's just a very important fishery for equity. Some of our previous work serves as a foundation for the efforts that we're currently leading and the problems that we're addressing together, which we really have co-produced in this earlier work, where we conducted a multi-year ethnographic and case study analysis of how communication shaped shellfishing and shellfish co-management. And in that research, we really identified a host of ways in which fishery leaders and participants were communicating about problems within wild shell fisheries. So one of the biggest problems, of course, is climate change and global change. And David Wilson, who is a clam harvester in Harpswell, really put this very well in a recent Shellfish Focus Day webinar, when he said that clammers in coastal communities are on the front lines of climate change, and they're already feeling the effects of warming ocean temperatures, which are changing predation patterns and causing declines in clam populations. Water quality remains a persistent problem. We've heard about and observed a host of unsustainable harvesting patterns and practices, such as the fact that license sales and landings are in steep decline. There are social conflicts within and between fisheries, as well as between governance contexts. Coastal access and gentrification is a huge issue, and one that actually seems to be intensifying during the pandemic with everything that's been going on with real estate. Multiple sources of economic uncertainty, many of which are connected to rural poverty, and then fluctuations within shellfish markets. And then we've heard and observed and continue to learn about the multiple ways in which structural inequities and racial, class, and gender bias affect individual and community health and well-being. In the context of our more current work in the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, we've also identified an additional set of issues. So we've increasingly recognized the need to expand and decolonize our work and connect more fully with Wabanaki fisheries interests and priorities. And Darren Ranko and I and Tony Sutton and others, our collaborators, recently published a paper that more fully details that work and how it relates to some previous work funded by the Safe Beaches and Shellfish Project. As we've been supporting towns in these projects, we're increasingly grappling with the kinds of challenges that rural communities face and the need for greater financial, civic, state, and tribal resources to support shellfish management and sustainability efforts. There are gaps in representation is the wild shell fishery doesn't have a statewide industry advocacy organization that we compare with, say, like the Maine Lobstermen's Association or the Maine Aquaculture Association. And this negatively affects news coverage and legislative advocacy. And of course, COVID has fundamentally changed how we work, in some cases actually strengthening some of the connections and building capacity for more online forms of engagement that weren't previously happening, but also intensifying some of the digital divides for people who do or do not have internet access. So in the 3 years since we published our initial findings, we've also come to a much better understanding of the needs and opportunities for adaptive and decolonial forms of governance. So comparing Maine and Wabanaki fisheries governance context would be a presentation and paper on its own, and I hesitate to go into great depth with this because this is really work that Tony is leading in his role as a community food facilitator in the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, but we did want to describe some of this work to provide that context for how we're working across Wabanaki and Maine context. So first and foremost, we recognize that all of our work occurs within Wabanaki homelands, and that tribal sovereignty, which includes food sovereignty and sustenance fishing, is the inherent right of Wabanaki peoples. The 1980 Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act is an important but also partial and problematic attempt to acknowledge these inherent rights. And the state and tribes are in the process of renegotiating these terms. The tribes have proposed revisions that would strengthen the commitment to honor their inherent rights to sovereignty over fisheries and natural resources. And so Tony is going to be conducting tribal fisheries research to help support those negotiations. For Maine, the 1640s and 1647 Massachusetts Bay Colony Ordinance provides an important policy context for Maine's current co-management system because this ordinance granted the rights to access the shore for fishing, fouling, and navigation, which has helped towns retain the right to steward their intertidal resources. And approximately 74 towns have elected to participate in the co-management by adopting a shellfish ordinance and partnering with the Maine Department of Marine Resources. So this combination of Wabanaki people's continued stewardship of intertidal fisheries, as well as the colonial history of maintaining access to the intertidal fishing activities, creates a context that is amenable for indigenous and community-led shellfish stewardship and conservation. And there have been a couple of different initiatives that have emerged over the last 5 years that I think show that, the possibilities and the window of opportunity within these contexts. And the first of these is the Maine Shellfish Restoration and Resilience Fund, which is funded by the Broadreach Fund at the Maine Community Foundation and really led by Andrea Perry, their grants coordinator. Over the last 3 years, they have funded 33 applied shellfish projects that are led by harvesters in towns and doing a range of things, and Gabby will be talking about those. And then over the last 5 years, there have been a number of emerging networks working across shellfishing and across scales. And you can see on the left here a picture of one of these, the soft-shell clam monitoring network that's led by the Down East Institute. But in this space, we also have the Down East Fisheries Partnership, the Casco Bay Regional Shellfish Working Group, the Community Science Investigations Network. So the Maine Shellfish Learning Network has tried to connect with these other initiatives and networks to try and leverage them and to strengthen the work that's going on within and across. So in response to these identified problems and within this context and these windows of opportunity, we identified the need to create the Maine Shellfish Learning Network with the mission of supporting learning, leadership, and equity in Maine and Wabanaki wild and clam and mussel fisheries. So why a learning network? This concept comes out of social ecological systems approaches to resilience. And this quote really helps illustrate some of the unique features of a learning network. As Per Olson describes, a learning network is about key leaders and shadow networks that can prepare a system for change by exploring alternative system configurations and developing strategies for choosing among possible futures. Key leaders can recognize and use or create windows of opportunity and navigate transitions towards adaptive governance. Successful transformations rely on epistemic or knowledge and shadow networks to provide novel ideas and ways of governing. We've also been drawing and orienting to indigenous approaches to learning and learning as a form of doing, which has also shaped our research. And this quote from Kim Tallbear, I think, really gets at that. She says, It's helpful to think creatively about the research process as a relationship building process, as a professional networking process with colleagues, not subjects, as an opportunity for conversation and sharing of knowledge, not simply data gathering. Research must then be conceived in less linear ways without necessarily knowable goals at the outset. A researcher who is willing to learn how to stand with a community of subjects is willing to be altered, to revise her stakes in the knowledge to be produced. So we have a number of commitments that reflect this engaged and decolonizing approach to research and that also support our intentions to promote learning, leadership, and equity. The first is we see listening and reciprocity as foundational for equity. These commitments shape the work that we do with our partners, but it also shapes how Gabby, Tony, and I collaborate with each other because we see all of the patterns in our work as connected, and we refer to this as recursivity or recursion. So for example, the three of us are really intentional about listening to each other and creating spaces for our diverse skill sets to help shape our collective work. We value multiple and diverse forms of knowledge, and we see knowledge not as something that any single one person holds, but as something that we make together in relationships. We're intentional about how writing shapes our collaborations and how creating things like technical reports and a website and these decision trees also create spaces for people to collaborate and learn from each other. And this is a concept that's also known as boundary objects. We're constantly talking about the relationship between names and power and seeking ways of naming differently, especially for place names that center Wabanaki histories and knowledges. And then finally, following Rauno Palkinen, we approach our work as a process of learning to learn through dialogue and active open reflection, as well as by doing applied social science research that we then feed back into the ongoing formation of a network. So these commitments have led to a set of practices, all of which are focused on building relationships and co-producing knowledge. So we've hosted a number of dialogues of varying sizes and formats. In the summer of 2019, set up a series of theme meetings. A number of people I see on this call participated in. We had a launch meeting in Millbridge in September that helped us identify and refine our initial set of priorities, and Gabby's going to describe those in just a moment. Provided ongoing support for applied shellfish projects in different ways. We've conducted 20 interviews to date. And then all of this has been figuring out how to do in the context of the pandemic and the different kinds of adjustments and adaptations and ways of staying connected. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gabby.
Great. Thank you, Bridie. So as Bridie said, our work in the context of standing with and developing a learning network really started with listening. And this practice of active listening shaped the MSLN's initial priorities or goals as these priority action items. In our September launch meeting in 2019, over 30 participants across institutional and geographic boundaries met to co-define what the MSLN should focus on. These 5 priority action items on the slide have shaped our work and research since then. And as you can see, they already attend to some of the conflicts that Bridie referenced earlier, including water quality, communication, market strategies in the face of economic uncertainty, building new resources for municipalities, and continuing to develop those relationships. And we've included a link below where there's a full report that goes into a bit more detail about both that meeting and these action items. Next slide, please. So what capacities have we built so far? Our focus on equity, learning, and leadership really shaped our approach to those priority action items. And like Bridie said, in the next part of this talk, I'll be discussing a few specific efforts that have built these new capacities and created new resources. These include the water quality decision tree, the Mudflat website, research on the impacts of the Maine Shellfish Learning Network and MSRF projects, as well as Shellfish Focus Day 2021. And on the right, you guys can see a short quote from one of our interviewees highlighting how the Maine Shellfish Learning Network as an organization with these multiple approaches to communication is fostering collaboration. So I quote, "You guys have the mechanism to reach out to so many people just with an email, with the list that you're developing and get people to start thinking, and maybe get more participation at these meetings. Because if we don't do something as a state, the Maine softshell clam is going to struggle, maybe to the point of near extinction, if we don't work together. So in that sense of collaboration, and next slide as well, I'm going to go ahead and share that idea of my story, as Freddie said, in light of Tony's absence, about how I became involved with this work and the different ways that reciprocity has really shaped how I'm doing my own research. So my first time on a clam flat, I went on a tour with Glenn Melvin, who's the vice president of the Waldoboro Shellfish Committee on the Madonomic River. And for those of you who know him, he's a pretty loud, brash, and very, very active man in the shellfish community in Waldoboro. And I sat on his boat, freezing, because we were there in March and it was pretty foggy, kind of straining to hear Glenn over his boat engine. And I was really listening to how he described this extensive work that he had done with the Madonomic Task Force, a collaborative group of state agency members and harvesters dedicated to understanding pollution problems in the water. He described DNA testing, smoke bomb septic tests, putting up signs, working with the town to put in new mandates about dogs on the town landing, all while waving to passing boats and other people, introducing me as a new pollution scientist. And I should note, Glenn was pretty cagey. He asked me a lot of pointed questions about how I thought the river was managed, how the science around those decisions was being done. And I had to make it pretty clear that I wasn't there as an expert in any capacity, but instead there as a learner. And I was taking what he said seriously, which was easy because I was. I found myself recognizing there was a lot of frustration about how science had been used to make management decisions that had impacted his livelihood. And this was the first time someone had called me a scientist outside of my family, which was really exciting and also extremely terrifying. This moment, along with many hours of future boat time, coursework, and my own reflections, really helped me understand the way that as a scientist, I hold a lot of inherent power, but I'm orienting myself to science as a service for the communities to help them better understand the problems that they're facing and come up with solutions that are salient and applicable to their spaces. And I included this picture here from a drift bucket study I did in Waldoboro to help answer the Shellfish Committee's questions about how water moves, where my buckets are on the right and clams are up on the left. And I'm hoping that this really shows how I want my science to fit and be accessible to the communities that it serves. So shifting back a bit to the efforts that the MSLN has led, I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to describe the water quality decision tree. Our first priority action item on that list was to connect key actors in water quality decision-making, and this project did just that. So the water quality decision tree is this multi-tiered resource for municipalities facing water quality issues. It serves as a guidance document outlining steps municipalities can take and managers involved in the decisions around water quality. And just to kind of pause there and give a bit of background, shellfish harvesting areas are classified by the Department of Marine Resources based on bacterial scores, or how much bacteria is in the water at any point in time. They can be closed, conditionally open, or restricted, or just open in order to protect consumers. But these closures can have really devastating economic impacts, especially conditional closures, where areas can close for 9 days or even longer every time there is a 1-inch rainfall in a 24-hour period. And as a result, many clamming communities are leading projects to find and fix pollution sources, as well as learn more about how this pollution moves in coastal spaces. Next slide. So first, to try and develop this water quality decision tree, the MSLN drew on its partners across these multiple spaces to develop a team with a diversity of knowledge and a diversity of skill sets. This included representatives from the Department of Marine Resources, the Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Health and Human Services, some of whom were able to join our talk today. And our first meeting in this very tiny conference room over some donuts and coffee included a lot of introductions, determining responsibilities, setting up listening guidelines for respect and acknowledgement and differences of opinion, as well as kind of these larger discussions about how all these different pieces each agency managed fit together. And these discussions demonstrated learning across institutional boundaries, as many members hadn't met each other in person or really understood the nuances of what each other did. And these photos on the right, are from our second meeting pre-COVID, which is why everyone doesn't have masks, where members of these different state agencies worked together to start sketching out ideas for this water quality decision tree. Next slide, please. So focusing in on that cycle of meetings, these photos all highlight the process from drawn-on flowcharts to this kind of more web-based or polished version of the decision tree. And I should note, each of these photos represents many different conversations, late night phone calls, chains of emails, and lots of reflections on our work together, meaning and knowledge. And this process was intense and a bit long, but the approach focused on eliciting feedback, responding, and developing these reciprocal relationships really worked. We developed this tool which serves municipalities, but also serves the members of the team that were helping define it. And members of this team highlighted that having this resource widely available could create new understanding around these decisions and new collaborative spaces to help solve water quality problems. And next slide. To make sure that this tool was widely shared, it was determined that developing this resource into an online platform that could be updated or added to as new knowledge or legislation changed would be really effective. But we also wanted to make sure that this information was available for people who didn't have internet access, again, attending to that equity in communication. So we developed both the water quality decision tree as an online platform and a workbook that has all of the information, but kind of set together in like in a work pamphlet. Now, this work eventually connected with another priority action item, this idea of improving information systems. And so as we were developing this water quality decision tree in this online platform, the MSLN developed the Mudflat website to house it and a number of other resources and information about the work we were doing and others were across the coast, as well as share these different types of histories and stories that envelop all within the Mudflat. The next slide, please. Now, when we started developing that website, the Mudflat, our team, Tony, Bridie, and I really revisited our commitment to equity, learning, and leadership. We wanted to tell multiple narratives and share stories across institutional, geographic, but also cultural spaces on the Mudflat. If you could click the sound, I wanted you guys to hear this. That in Passamaquoddy and Maliseet means you go to the Mudflat if you want to get clams in English. And that phrase really echoes kind of the way that we approach this website. We went to our partners and communities to learn, shape, and develop it. You can move on to the next slide. So within that website and with that orientation, we wanted to share again those multiple resources and tell decolonized histories about shellfishing in this region. As shown on the right, we incorporated Wabanaki language in our naming practices, using it as menu titles, shellfish names, and ecosystem features. And we hoped this would promote interacting with the diversity of stories from coastal communities and histories. We also developed and shared resources like the water quality decision tree, information about scientific techniques, news about coastal spaces, as well as other resources for municipalities, specifically how to respond to COVID-19. And we also developed a number of different types of accessible information about intertidal ecosystems, issues facing the wild clam and mussel fisheries, as well as some fun facts about shellfish species and how to cook them. And it's important to note, this is a huge collective effort and a continuous one. We lean on our partners throughout the development of this project. And we also worked with a number of community leaders to understand what information was wanted and incorporate the different stories and knowledges on each of these topics. This website is organic and it continues to change its shape to match the needs of the wild clam and mussel fishery. The next slide, please. To pivot a bit, I wanted to also share some of the research we've been doing from the MSLN. So as stated before, the Maine Shellfish Restoration and Resilience Projects, or MSRF, is a group of 33 community-led projects across the coast developed over 3 years. And these projects work on multiple topics, such as identifying sources of pollution, developing new innovations with cohogs, enhancing clam populations, understanding predation. And this map here shows a few project title examples, but the dots in blue and orange also highlight where all these projects are taking place. So it's a pretty wide spanning space. And for example, one of the projects in the St. George River, the 5-town shellfish committee there is using a multi-pronged approach where they not only take water samples to be DNA tested to understand if animals are causing pollution, but they're also deploying buckets to understand water currents, reseeding areas to improve clam flat productivity, and using spat boxes to try and understand how settlement and recruitment is happening there. Now, as part of our research process, we've been trying to work to understand how the MSLN, other organizations, as well as the MSRF projects are helping to improve the adaptive capacity of these and other coastal communities. The next slide, please. To give you a bit more detail about our research, over the summer and fall of 2020, we conducted 20 interviews with partners, community leaders, and others across the coast. And as part of our recent analysis, we wanted to just share a few findings about the different ways the MSLN and MSRF are creating new impacts. And on the left, we created this word cloud, where change and communication are some of the most frequently used words in responses to how is the MSRF project changing your community? And we can really highlight that this idea of communication, organization, individuals, and towns are some of the most frequently mentioned. We've also seen the MSLN mentioned in many different ways as part of the support system helping towns accomplish their research goals. That first quote on the top, the MSLN and the MSLN's leadership, is highlighted as foundational in connecting towns across these projects. And I quote, "There's lots of people with good ideas. There's lots of people with energy for it. But you just have to give them the funds to be able to get going, and some, perhaps equally, the expertise of the leadership within your group that helps put them in connection with the science that's required." This, along with the second quote, also highlights how these wild clam and mussel communities are connecting with scientific collaborators and others to learn and co-produce new knowledge. And I quote, "I just think the towns need to find support to help them get stuff done, to get their visions and their goals in the flats. I think that's what it all comes down to, is them having the support that they need, because if not, they're the ones with really all the information." Now, our research is ongoing and designed to be responsive and adaptive to the feedback from our participants, and we're currently still analyzing a lot of the findings from our initial set of interviews, but I hope to share more findings in the future as part of my dissertation. Next slide. So just kind of as one of the last big efforts we've been dealing with most recently, the MSLN has also developed a remote alternative to Shellfish Focus Day for 2021. For those that don't know, Shellfish Focus Day is a day historically held the Thursday before the Fishermen's Forum, and it usually includes multiple presentations and talks from community leaders, scientists, and managers sharing information about the wild clam and mussel fisheries. The research and work published in the McGreavy et al. 2018 study that was referenced earlier continues to highlight that this Shellfish Focus Day requires a collaborative approach to planning in order to maintain equity and learning across institutional and cultural boundaries. So leaning on that previous expertise, we worked with our partners, such as the Casco Bay Working Group and the Down East Fisheries Partnership, to create 3 webinars where panelists were able to share their stories and talk with each other, co-defining things like an upweller, as shown on the right. The panelists highlighted diverse forms of leadership and multiple skill sets used by those leaders, as well as histories that interact across the coast. And this, again, wouldn't have been possible without this collaborative space. For example, Jessica Joyce from the Casco Bay Regional Shellfish Group was able to organize our teams and help schedule webinars, and Natalie Springwell from Sea Grant helped facilitate each of these webinars, editing and rebroadcasting them on the radio on WERU 89.9 Coastal Conversations, which you can find on their website. We again focused on equity, we worked hard to create a platform that amplified clammer voices, either online on the Maine Clamming YouTube channel, which now houses the webinars, as well as over the radio. And our next event will be on April 14th from 2 to 4, where we focus on shellfish markets and seafood supply chains. And I believe Bridie and I can share the link if anyone is interested. But all these efforts kind of collectively highlight the different ways that the MSLN has attended to equity, learning, and leadership throughout our work. And we've been doing it through collaborative, engaged, and reciprocal approaches. And I'll pass it back on to Bridie.
Thanks, Gabby. That's a perfect transition to this final piece of reflecting on, what this learning network approach helps to create. We have seen and been able to document the ways in which these efforts have contributed to building new relationships and connections between diverse leaders across contexts and institutions. We've seen multiple forms of evidence for increased abilities and recognition of the importance of listening, engaging in cross-cultural communication and dialogue, and respect for differences in multiple forms of knowledge. And then we've also built capacity for specific adaptive forms of governance. As I mentioned, Tony's leading the effort to do this tribal fisheries research to support the Settlement Act negotiations, and we'll be conducting focus groups with top tribal members in the coming months. We are also in early stages of dialogue with the Penobscot Nation's Water Resources Program and the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians Natural Resource Department to build from what we learned in the process of doing the water quality decision tree work to connect with their water quality and watershed management interests. And then finally, as Gabby mentioned, we're learning a lot about the factors that have been shaping adaptive capacities in the Maine Shellfish Restoration and Resilience projects. And one of the biggest challenges that we've heard from a number of different people, and that has also come up at the Shellfish Advisory Council, is that the way in which shellfish restoration activities, especially for people who are trying to grow clams to be able to reseed clam spots, are being regulated as aquaculture is a huge constraint. It puts additional burdens on harvesters and towns to comply with these regulations that are really not the best fit, because technically, growing seeds for restoration is not really aquaculture in a traditional sense. So we're going to be working closely with Manomet, Tidal Bay Consulting, the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Down East Fisheries Partnership, DMR, the Maine Shellfish Advisory Council, and related groups to figure out how we can best advance changes to this specific regulation. And then finally, as we connect across the Maine and Wabanaki fisheries, we feel some of the tensions and contradictions in doing this work, especially for how co-management is a colonial state-based institution. But we're also taking guidance and inspiration from critical race and post-colonial scholars who emphasize the value of what they call tidal imaginaries for working in these in-between, indeterminate tidal spaces to promote change and decolonization. Here I'm drawing from work by Edward Toussaint and Kamu Brathwaite, Tara Nukuti, and Tiffany Losavo King. So I want to just end with a quote that really points to this from Tiffany Losavo King's Black Shoals. In this book, she uses the concept of shoaling to talk about, how intertidal spaces invite unique opportunities for addressing colonization and systems of oppression. And she says, even if our current terms leave us wanting, we cannot stop our pursuit of ethical connection to one another. I believe that our yet to come notions of connectedness and relationality are capacious enough to yield something more than coalitional in the end. So in sum, we really think that the tides matter for this work, and that tidal spaces are really potent spaces for change and for opening up new possibilities for the future. I want to end with some gratitude for the multiple forms of support that make this work possible. Of course, our funders, the Broadreach Fund and the Maine Community Foundation, and Diana Davis Spencer Fund and Mitchell Center, huge support of this work. Gabby's work is funded by the National Research Traineeship, Conservation Science, funded by NSF. There are so many partners who are involved in this work. We tried to give an indication of that in the quotes that we're using and the references that we make throughout the presentation, but we're deeply grateful for the many forms of support that have really contributed to the work that we just shared, and that will be ongoing. And so with that, I'll stop the share, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Bridie, and this is Linda Silka, everyone, and Bridie and Gabby. We've had a wonderful series of talks this semester. This one just rises in many ways to the top in terms of the very, very clear way you describe things, but also the complications you helped us begin to think about and understand. And we're of course sorry that Tony wasn't able to join us, but we look forward to hearing his perspective again as time goes on. If you look at the list of the different, in the polling that Ruth helped to do and who is listening and being a part of the group today, there are many, many students here. It would be, I think, so helpful to all of us to hear from you about what you think students could learn or should be learning or doing. What kinds of partnerships should they be thinking about as they're building their future?
Gabby, this one seems teed up for you specifically. I can certainly reflect on that, but I also would love to invite some dialogue too, if that's possible, because there are a number of other students, I don't want to call them out, but Soheb and Katie Clark I see on the line, and probably others as well, who've been involved in this type of work and in the learning network efforts as well. So if they have contributions or thoughts on this, would be interested in opening this up. But Gabby, do you want to take a first pass at this?
Sure. Thank you for calling me out, and thank you, Linda, for your comments. I really appreciate it. I think really one of the biggest things I've learned in terms of partnerships is that idea of reciprocity and listening, where I think a lot of the times, especially in the academic sense, we think of these partnerships as very project-oriented or very task-oriented, where I have found it much more valuable to think of them as these much more longer term relationships, individual to individual or organization to organization, that can span a lot of different contexts. And I also think that idea of actively listening and being able to respond to that, while a lot of that is based on the student, it's also based on the professors and advisors that are around that student. But I think the more access students have to kind of create that foundation of understanding how to work with these communities can really help shape them both professionally and individually, and understanding where they sit as a scientist.
That's very, very helpful. One of the interesting challenges that we all face is when we're students and we see ways that maybe our mentors or our faculty or other people that we're working with don't quite understand, and that they have a lot to learn, but may not feel like they're still learners. How, and this isn't a hard question, but how do you, as a graduate student, take that on? What would you like to see changed, and how would you begin to have that happen?
As in terms of the context of kind of promoting learning across, I think across kind of this boundary of power too, that's always inherent to a lot of those conversations. I think really trying to create those collaborative spaces that deal on those personal and professional relationships is really important. And I'd also just say that it's pretty surprising as a student every time I am listened to, but also it's usually surprising that I'm listening to people, especially responding to Angie's question in the chat. Many harvesters and other individuals who I've been talking to don't always expect that, and I think students often feel the same way. And so just trying to create that more collaborative or open space for dialogue would be important.
Great, thank you. And Kathleen Clark says in the chat, I concur wholeheartedly with Gabby's insights on building partnerships with individuals and communities in this work. We don't have the capability to get people's voices today, but we can certainly learn from what people are putting in chat.
Yeah, and just as a little context, Katie Clark was an undergraduate student at College of the Atlantic, worked closely with Chris Peterson, who's also on the call, and really did a fantastic engaged project with wormers. So I think similarly understands, what it means to engage, and some of the interesting things that you learn when you show up in intertidal mudflats.
Thank you. That's very helpful. As you think about the interesting partners that have been a part of this important work, there are intriguing power differences that are often at play when you have people or groups that are able to decide kind of what's supposed to be going on someplace, and may not quite be used to listening to people for whom this land belongs. How do you have recommendations for how all of us that are listening today can learn more about that and what we might do?
Yeah, that's a big question.
I know those are hard.
And a really important one. But I think just, reflecting on our process, there are a number of things that come to mind. And the first is that it is a learning process, and that we are learning these histories together. And for me, from my perspective, and coming from being a white settler, learning that much of the history that I've been taught is wrong, and has erased Wabanaki peoples in Maine. And so confronting that and thinking about what do we do with that, and how do we change the kinds of histories and stories that we tell about what it means to live in this place together. I think that it also takes time, a much longer period of time, and going back to Angie's question too, time that is spent in dialogue and listening, and really being opening to learning across those differences, and to recognizing that power is really complex, and that it's changeable, and that we feel it a lot of the time. And so when we bump up against those tensions, maybe we're in a space where there's power at play, and we really need to look at what that's about, and what the disparities might be, and then think about how do we address those.
Very helpful, very interesting and important. Another question that's come in, and this one's from Catherine Glover, is for outreach, how do you set up project webinars to be less one way and encourage the listening and dialogue that has been a theme throughout your work? And that's a great question.
Gabby, do you want to talk a little bit about the process that we use for setting up the Shellfish Focus Day webinar? I can chime in afterwards.
Yeah, so I guess the process was pretty, we wanted to make sure not only we had a diverse number of voices across the panel, but we also really wanted to create space for the panelists to talk to each other. And we also had, as much time to kind of respond to Q&A as possible. And very often these webinars ran long, but that's also part of that time process that Bridie was referencing. So we inherently set up the structure where panelists could kind of share their own thoughts and stories to each other, as well as to the audience. And we invited the audience to participate in kind of helping define some of the terms and issues that the harvesters and other members of the panel were able to talk about. So I guess that would respond to that.
Yeah, and related to what Gabby was just describing, I think emphasizing the structure of the webinar itself, we've also found that the planning process has been a really important part of encouraging dialogue among the participants and among the planners. And it's been amazing to see the kinds of connections that have been formed in the context of the webinar that then have led to additional follow-on conversations that might not have existed. So beyond the value of the webinar for the audience members, there's been incredible value of these webinars for the people who are directly involved in them too. Linda, I wonder if we wanted to jump back up to a question that Chris Peterson asked about.
I was just going to ask you.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I read it out loud in case people aren't looking? But, so Chris Peterson asked a great question. Bridie, could you talk about the advantages of having students doing interviews?
Yeah. So in terms of, again, this, this recurring theme that we have related to listening, I find interviews to be obviously so conducive for listening and to listen in a very structured way, and especially when, a faculty advisor, a student might have this inclination themselves, there's, that commitment to sharing back with the community what was heard and how the interview then connected with the insights that were produced. And so, it's just a very intentional way of approaching the listening process. It's an incredibly rich way of learning, and it can contribute to ongoing relationship building as well, especially if these relationships, well, in two ways. If they already exist between the faculty advisor or a group of people, and the student is then able to enter into these relationships and continue that listening and relationship building process, or if it's a new relationship and the student is able to do that kind of outreach through the interviews, it can really expand the number of people who are involved in any given effort.
That's just...
Gabby, anything to add to that from a student perspective?
I would also add that at least the idea of learning, I think most people are familiar with being a student or know a student or like have empathy already if you are a student entering into an interview space or into a new space. So I found, at least in my work, that even though there can be kind of historical conflict, that idea of orienting yourself to a learner or a student can help kind of mitigate how that colors a conversation in an interview space.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Another question that is in some ways related, and this is from Angie Reed, is, do you have suggestions for how people can navigate through the discomfort that often comes or can come with this kind of work?
Yeah. We use a phrase that comes from Donna Haraway. The idea is finding ways of staying with the trouble. And I think in part that means recognizing that there is discomfort, that these are not easy conversations, and that there's a lot of emotional work that comes with decolonization and with addressing systems of oppression and advancing justice. For me, having mentors in this, it has been really important. People I can turn to talk about that discomfort and where it's coming from and how to work through it. I think this is true of engaged work in general, but it's a different kind of research that is very effortful. It takes a lot of time and energy, and so paying attention to one's own individual well-being as well, and taking care of oneself, so that you can continue to do this work over the long term, which is what is required, being able to stay with and stand with, for the duration. So those are some commitments that I found to be really important, as well as, this isn't necessarily something you talk a lot about in like formal research, but attending to some of the other relationship qualities like friendship, that you can have these affinities with people in this work that really make it more than just research.
Great, really, so much to think about. Gabby, you mentioned that often people talk about lots of frustration in how science has been used. And your program, what you're doing, what Tony's doing, what you're all doing together and with all of your partners, is about doing science in a different way. if we wanted to know more about your work and learn more about it, where could we look, or how could we learn more about what your partners are doing? Where do we go so that we can just take baby steps to learn from all of you?
Not to self-plug, but a lot of our collective work is actually on the mudflat.org, which is our Maine Shellfish Learning Network website. And then the Mitchell Center and Elizabeth Soleil has also published a few articles, I think, about our work that should be relatively easy to find through the UMaine website. And if anybody has any specific questions for me or my approach, and I'm sure Bridie would echo this as well, please feel free to reach out over email. And I'd be more than happy to chat.
And we have one last question, which is from Abigail Conrad. It's, can you describe any substantive changes in shellfish management that have occurred as a result of decolonization and input from the Wabanaki? A great question to end on.
Yeah, so the work in that part of our MSLN set of priorities is still formative, but I would encourage people to really pay close attention to the Settlement Act negotiations and to also become involved in those, because those are going to be a really important part of advancing decolonization in the context of tribal fisheries management and sovereignty over natural resources. And certainly we will stay in touch as we learn more and continue to advance this work.
Thank you so much for helping us learn today and for having us all think about how we can take what we're learning today, share it with other people. And we may not be working with clams, but we're working with a lot of the issues that you talked about. And it's been just a delightful opportunity. I'm sure everyone feels that way, to learn from you today. That we very much look forward to continued conversation. And can everybody, if you know how to put a thank you or something up, a little clapping hand just to say how great this was. I'm afraid we've run out of time. And this has really, really been very, very great for learning. Thank you.